This video is a belated response intended to systematically address Sam Owl's last video to me, The Flaws of Race in IQ. For those unfamiliar with what's going on, the debate at hand concerns the truth or falsity of race realism. In this video, I will deliberately speak about Sam Owl rather than to him. This is because I do not care to have discussions with people who lie, omit, misrepresent, and who intentionally use fallacies designed to win an argument by compromising integrity. As a general principle, I try to presume my opponents are honest until proven otherwise. However, Sam Owl's response completely obliterated my presumption. I initially hoped that our interaction might maintain a basic level of civility, but given Sam Owl's clear dishonesty displayed in his new video, I am convinced that civility with him is no longer possible or even desirable. As such, while I think Sam's lies, omissions, and other fallacies require some addressing, and I shall repeatedly substantiate these charges throughout the video, I do not think that Sam deserves to be talked to directly, and so I will refrain from doing so. In his video, Sam starts out by accusing me of contradicting myself, and implies that I was actually hypocritical for responding to him. Interestingly enough, Sam actually claims that my alleged hypocrisy is really acceptable on the grounds that he himself was also a hypocrite. Sam Owl claims that I acted hypocritically because A, I did not make any overt attempts to refute Sam's claims when I left comments on his initial video. B, that in the first few comments to him, I claimed I was busy with other things that actually mattered. And C, that I said a refutation of his video wouldn't meaningfully move a debate forward. Notice, at no point did I ever say or suggest that I would not make a video response to Sam. If I had done this and then went on to make my video, then charges that I contradicted myself would be warranted. However, given that I did no such thing, this claim is obviously false. The fact that Sam would say such a thing amazes me. Sam knew exactly what I said to him, and yet he still accused me of something that was obviously false. The only conclusion I can draw from this fact is that Sam apparently chose to lie about something utterly trivial to the topic at hand. But why bother? My best guess is that he's trying to save face by dragging my credibility through the very same mud that he's in. After all, unlike me, he freely admitted to hypocrisy in his exchange with me when he said, quote, "I'll be a hypocrite and make a refutation video when I get the time." Next, Sam expresses indignation at the basic principle of debate that in order for someone to be justified when making a universal claim or sweeping generalization about the beliefs of a group of people, ones which aren't common knowledge, one must first specify who one is talking about and give evidence of what such folk actually said or believe. Now, presumably, Sam's indignation stems partly from the fact that he obviously did not do this in his last video, or at least in his first video. Sam claims further in his private message to me, quote, "My definition of race realist was the definition of race realist I had encounters with." He also says,
"At the time of my video, it was very clear to me and to everybody who watched my video who I was referring to. In actuality, you're the first person out of anyone to even challenge who I was referring to. Everyone else seemed to already know and not argue about it. If you look at my statements in the context made, it's pretty clear who I was talking about. But when I offered a clarification, you dismissed it and continued as though the clarification were never made. If there's an issue with whom I'm addressing, I reserve the right to clarify that, and you're obligated to accept my clarification. If not, then you've just conceded that you do not have to accept any explanation I give for any of my views. In which case, you've dismissed the premise of debate, and there was no point in making a video response to me provoking a debate, unless your goal wasn't to debate but to give yourself the appearance of intellectual honesty and information literacy."
Notice, Sam offers no evidence that I dismissed his clarification during our exchange. He then added, quote, "Honestly, my overall issue with the video response was that it misrepresented the intentions of my argument. It was not a generalization of all race realists. It was a statement against the specific ones I was dealing with. To which I acknowledged his statement by saying, quote, "Then say that. Don't say race realists are XYZ. Say who you're talking about. Say what they said, and give reasons why they fit your description. And say that you're only talking about those specific people. That is, unless you have some good argument and evidence that would allow you to generalize." Thus, we can see that contrary to Sam's claim that I allegedly dismissed clarification, I fully acknowledged his clarification, but persisted in holding to a standard that requires people in a debate to give basic empirical evidence regarding the positions of those whom they disagree with, so as to avoid erecting strawman versions of people's actual positions. In my message to Sam, I explicitly said, quote, "A. You didn't say anything to the effect of, 'I'm only describing things true of a few race realists I talked to in the comment section. So all the statements I make about race realists in this video are only ever talking about them. In your video, you only asserted things about race realists full stop. That implies that you're either talking about race realists generally or all race realists everywhere, and not a particular small subset of them. B. At no point in your video did you ever provide a definition of race realism." In his new video, Sam alleges that the reason why I brought up this standard was a ploy to give myself the veneer of intellectual honesty. Then he had the gall to say that my upholding of a basic standard was some sort of cheap shot or rhetorical ploy designed to trivialize his argument. Sam provides no reason for his claim, and he certainly had plenty of reason to believe the contrary from our exchange. My impression of Sam's behavior is that he is simply being a sore loser and is saying such things in order to recap the credibility he's lost by playing the victim.
Let's say I did, however, mean all race realists. Do I need to define who they are? Do I need to define who is a Democrat if I make a video about Democrats? What about feminists or MRAs? The entirety of the videos are addressed to those who are familiar with what I have to deal with, not those who are completely unfamiliar with the topic. If they don't know what I'm talking about, then they should do a bit of an encyclopedic research beforehand.
That is clearly a false analogy. Feminists, Democrats, and to a lesser extent MRAs are all terms that fall within the domain of common knowledge. Race realism is a very obscure term, wholly unknown to the overwhelming majority of people, just like the term brights or identitarians. As such, definitions are required to explain such unfamiliar terms when they are the topic of a public debate. Furthermore, in Sam Owl's first video, the predicates he attached to race realists were racist, disingenuous, and cowardly. He then implied that race realists were deceitful, and he actually likened them to murderers. Sam Owl apparently thinks that the thought crime of race realism is actually on par with the real crime of murdering someone. If one were trying to glean a definition of race realism from Sam's video, one would erroneously think that race realism must be some horrendous basket of bad value judgments, when in actuality it's just a series of factual claims that could be true or false. Sam Owl should always expect that rational audiences will demand evidence from anyone who makes what appear to be unsupported and sweeping statements about an entire group of people, in order that such statements might be reasonably believed.
You also continue on to give me the race realist definition of race realism, but before that you talked about my self-serving arguments?
How is operationally defining a set of facts entailed by a given label self-serving? Sam gives no argument for this claim, and then he smugly implies through his body language that such definitions are self-serving. He does this as if this somehow magically relieves him of the need to provide actual reasons for the contested claims he makes. Unfortunately for him, his smug attitude doesn't absolve him of his blatant failure to meet the burden of proof. Sam then rejects the claim that he appealed to authority in his first video by saying,
"It's funny because you just cited my source. In The Anatomy of Violence by Adrian Raine and researcher Zhang Hong Liu of the University of South Carolina."
By saying this, Sam simply repeated in his video the very same thing he said to me in his message, thereby ignoring my rebuttal. The only support Sam gives for his denial stems from his after-the-fact description of the academic credentials of the author he name-dropped in his first video. However, listing such credentials of an author after the fact does not refute the claim that Sam fallaciously appealed to authority, because one could have done this and one could have still appealed to authority. In any case, since my basic argument is the same, let me read the message I sent to Sam. Quote, "You have not fulfilled or stated the conditions of permissible citations of authority figures required to support a position in a debate when making universal claims about all instances of something, which you did do, although I do accept that you were mistaken. When you're appealing to authorities in order to substantiate a universal claim or other law-like statement, you must cite a consensus of experts with regard to a given issue, settled with lots of evidence, and not simply the assertion of a single researcher. To see why, suppose I said, undoubtedly it is universally true everywhere in all cases that some of the average race differences in intelligence are caused by genetic variation between the races. To see why, read 30 years of research on race differences in cognitive ability, which was authored by Arthur Jensen, a professor emeritus at UC Berkeley who authored over 400 scientific articles and who was the most cited and one of the most cited and most eminent psychologists of the 20th century, and who also received several of the most prestigious academic awards for his contributions to intelligence research. There, I proved it. Would that convince you? No, of course not, because although Jensen is a great researcher, there is no scientific consensus on the cause of race and IQ differences. Furthermore, when citing an authority which you don't claim proves a universal claim, but in which you merely cite a figure in order to support a given position, one must mention the academic research or peer-reviewed paper one is talking about, or the qualifications of the person uttering the sentence. You said nothing about Adrian Raine. As far as we know, he could have been a high school dropout and your uncle. You have to show otherwise, and it's your burden to meet, not ours. From here, Sam attempts to address my contention that he offered no evidence for the assertions he made in his first video that,
just to get this out of the way, violence and criminality are without a doubt a response to environment in all cases.
Sam then goes on to say,
along with the APA and the APIRE, came to the conclusion that in all cases of violent behavior, there was an environmental factor that could not be removed in predicting violent behavior. These environmental factors included poverty, abuse, malnutrition, and lack of education. So yes, all instances of violence and criminality are a result of environment. Now, that may not be the only factor. There are biological and genetic explanations for criminal behavior, but the fact is that environment cannot be removed from the equation, while race most certainly can, as we'll see in the rest of my video, unless you're speaking from a social standpoint, like average rates of crime. I never said that is the only factor, just that all instances of violence are a result of environment, which they are.
Now, it is absolutely trivial to say that every instance of violence is the result of environment. All phenotypes are the result of gene-environment interactions. We literally couldn't imagine it otherwise. You can watch a gene in a petri dish until you're blue in the face, and it will never assault someone, cause someone to assault someone else, or turn your eyes blue. Now, the straightforward way to interpret Sam's statement would be to presume that he means that within the entire human population, all the phenotypic variants in aggression and crime are due purely to environmental factors and not genetic factors. However, such a statement is obviously wrong to anyone with a basic sense of behavioral genetics research on the subject. In his video, Sam appears to be providing a basic clarification of his position. He wants us to believe that he was only stating a trivial but basic fact about genes and the environment. If this were true, then Sam would not have said anything inconsistent with the discoveries of behavioral genetics. Regarding this point, I can certainly see how a reasonable observer watching this debate might charitably grant what appears to be Sam's genuine attempt at clarification. There's only one problem. In Sam Al's message to me, he explicitly conceded that the claim he made about the environmentality of criminality was wrong. Here's what Sam said verbatim in the message he sent me. Quote, "Since I made that assertion, I realized that my claim was in fact invalid because it didn't even accurately represent my views. Genetics can play a role in criminal behavior. Some people are predetermined to commit violence, but it's not caused by racial differences." End quote. Both of Sam's statements on this issue cannot be reconciled. In private, Sam concedes that the claims he made were invalid. But in public, Sam confidently suggests that he said nothing invalid, but was merely stating a basic fact about genetics. Not once does Sam make any public admission that he said anything invalid, but in private, he easily concedes this fact without any argument. The most reasonable conclusion we can draw here is that Sam Al probably misspoke and poorly represented his position in his first video, such that a reasonable observer would think that he was asserting that phenotypic variance in criminality was caused purely by environmental factors. However, rather than publicly admitting his mistake, like he did in private, Sam Al dishonestly pretended as if his revised position presented in his second video was the same thing he'd been saying all along. This appears to be a slimy attempt by Sam Al to preserve his credibility by neglecting to mention inconvenient truths about his past mishaps.
There's a bit of content after this part which I will not refute, since a lot of the content was redundant, such as using visual aids to illustrate two premises and a conclusion. It really wasn't needed, and if I were to take another guess, you included it for the same reason that you included your earlier elaborate explanation of your misrepresentation of the intent in my video, and why that intent would be ambiguous. As my old AP English teacher would say, when one is promulgating esoteric cogitations, beware platitudinous ponderosities. In real terms, when you're talking about a subject that only a select few people know about, beware of redundant loads of shit.
Let me get this straight. So I provided a clear and concise logical argument which refuted Sam Al's central point. Now apparently, my doing this was A, redundant, B, part of some grand ploy to misrepresent my intentions, and C, was also a ruse I used to deceive people by using unnecessarily complicated language? And on top of that, Sam's reason for thinking this is simply something he made up out of thin air? Next, Sam cautions me when citing sources about the heritability of criminality. He says that I should only cite peer-reviewed journals when discussing the topic, apparently implying that I have used non-peer-reviewed sources when talking about the issue. Yet if anyone looks at the articles I cited, all of which were listed in my video's description, they'll see that quite literally all of my citations about the heritability and genetics of criminality were peer-reviewed, with the exception of a single New York Times Science article which interviewed several mainstream behavioral genetics researchers about the literature on the subject. Next, Sam continues on a slew of red herring criticisms toward many of the heritability estimates of aggression, impulsivity, and criminality surveyed in the meta-analysis I mentioned. Chief of Sam's criticisms were his arguments concerning the methodological problems of self-reported data. Ironically, the meta-analysis I was quoting from was actually co-authored by Adrian Raine, the very person whom Sam Al repeatedly referenced by name in order to laughably support his mistaken assertion that human beings are blank slates when it comes to criminality. Sam then amusingly advises against using studies that involve self-reported behavior, despite the fact that this is a common practice in social science research and even some hard science research, which is used to falsify testable predictions. The fact of the matter is, Sam made a universal claim, in which he implied that all the variation in crime, aggression, and impulsivity is only ever the result of environmental and not genetic factors, a fact which we have now established he was less than honest about. Hence, to refute him, all I had to do in my last video was show a single exception to his claim. I did this by showing that heritability estimates of aggression, impulsivity, and violence obtained by self-reported data from twins or measured data on twins from researchers all indicate that there are significant heritabilities of violence, crime, aggression, and impulsivity, and that no such study found the environmentality of such traits to be 100%. Thus, I easily refuted what Sam implied in his first video. Sam then goes on to criticize the methodology of two of the studies I cited on the genetics of criminality. However, his criticism is irrelevant, as Sam has already conceded the point that genes explain some of the individual variation in crime when he said in his message to me, quote, "Genetics can play a role in criminal behavior. Some people are predetermined to commit violence, but it's not the cause of racial differences." End quote. Sam then goes on to attack my commentary on the MAOA gene.
Let's talk a bit about the realities behind MAOA. As my friend Alexis put it, single gene explanations for complex behavioral traits are almost always tried and refuted.
Oh, God.
This is a giant straw man argument. Nobody ever said that the variants of the MAOA gene explained all of the variation in crime, aggression, and impulsivity, like some sort of Mendelian trait for eye color explains the eye color phenotype. Such complex traits clearly have a polygenetic basis. The claim that I made was that the 2R and 3R MAOA variants might explain some, but not all of the variation in crime rates of individuals and perhaps between groups.
For anyone who has familiarized themselves with behavioral genetics, this shouldn't come as a surprise. The fact is that a single gene is very unlikely on its own to influence any kind of complex behavior without the presence of another gene, especially a single amine group such as MAOA. When you do testing for a single gene, you often overlook many other possible factors, such as other genes involved or gene-to-environment interaction required to activate the gene.
Now, obviously, a single gene won't influence a complex behavior without the presence of another gene. But then again, who is Sam Owl arguing against? Neither I nor anyone else I've seen in this debate has said anything to the contrary. Sam seems to have constructed a fictional debate in his mind against people who don't actually exist. Sam then claims that the gene expression levels of the MAOA gene are comparatively higher in areas not related to the brain or adrenal glands, such as kidneys or breasts, and are comparatively lower in areas related to the brain or adrenal glands. Now, I looked up the source of Sam's data in the gene expression atlas he cited. As you can see in the following slide, the gene depicted in the atlas does appear to be the MAOA gene, and the expression levels he mentioned are as described. However, there is a fundamental problem regarding the expression levels depicted in the data cited by Sam Owl. First, the gene expression atlas Sam cited used studies as references to derive the MAOA gene's expression levels, which appear to be totally irrelevant to the estimated gene expression levels it lists for the MAOA gene. Furthermore, atlases aren't primary or secondary sources, but are tertiary sources. Tertiary sources are generally far less reliable than secondary sources, which are themselves inferior to primary sources. There are 3 studies mentioned in the expression atlas cited, which are purported to be used by the atlas in order to derive the gene expression estimates for the MAOA gene. The first study appears to have only looked at non-coding RNAs, which are irrelevant to the gene expression levels of the MAOA gene. The second study looked at messenger RNA genetic sequences in breast tumors occurring in women, which appeared to have no apparent relevance to the MAOA's overall gene expression. Lastly, the third and final study compared organ transcriptomes in a number of vertebrate species over millions of years and looked at the splicing complexity of these vertebrates. It also compared splicing profiles of physiologically equivalent organs and discovered that these profiles are more strongly associated to the identity of species than they are to the type of organ. Now, what this has to do with the MAOA gene's expression level, I haven't the faintest idea. The Atlas SAM link does not reveal how it inferred the gene expression levels of the MAOA gene from this research. Thus, as there appears to be no connection between the Atlas and its references, and because it is a tertiary source, it appears prima facie to be both unreliable and thus unacceptable as evidence in a debate. The second problem with Sam's argument is more fundamental. Let's assume Sam Al was correct in his assertion about gene expression. It would still be true that we cannot infer the effect size of particular enzymes have on the body based solely on how many of those enzymes there are. The metabolic reactions caused by a small number of these proteins could still have huge effects on the human body, despite the fact that such quantities are rather small. Here's a more concrete analogy. A single match, while small in quantity, can still burn down an entire forest under the right conditions. Thus, just like it would be erroneous to conclude that small quantities of matches can only have small effects, it is also erroneous to conclude that low MAOA gene expression can only have small effects on the brain and human behavior.
In order for MAOA to have any effect on the areas which have low gene expression, there would need to be an abundance of another gene in the same area to impair the function of the MAOA gene, or from the result of an external stimulus to activate the gene. This is shown in a study by Kwan et al., where the correlate between MAOAL and lower IQ scores was only found when the gene variant interacted with the catechol O-methyltransferase, or COMT gene. COMT was not found to independently have an influence on IQ scores either.
As we have already shown, Sam Al has not demonstrated that the 2R and 3R variants of the MAOA gene have lower than average gene expression. Secondly, even if he had, it does not follow that there would need to be another gene nearby responsible for impairing the 2R or 3R variants of the MAOA gene, and which were also responsible for the association between these variants and violence. Sam's claim here is that such a thing must be true because the low repeat variance of the MAOA gene's association to low IQ is supposedly dependent upon a gene interaction between MAOAL and the COMT gene. Thus, Sam reasons that the same thing must be true of MAOAL's relationship to violence and crime. Using Sam's logic, we would have to claim that because the relationship between the amount of food we consume and the number of cavities we get depends on our dental hygiene, that therefore the relationship between the amount of food we consume and the bitterness of our food also depends on our dental hygiene. However, this is absurd. We know that the association of food quantity to food bitterness is independent of how well we take care of our teeth. Thus, it does not follow, because X's association to Y depends on T, that X's association to Z also depends on T, because we can imagine several possible circumstances where that does not happen. Sam then continues by claiming that the MAOA gene's association with violence was completely quashed when one looked at people who were not abused as children. However, who is Sam arguing against? In my last video, I explicitly acknowledged that the 3R variant's association with violence was significantly reduced when one excludes people who were abused as children. So, what point is Sam trying to make here? It's worth mentioning that in my last video, I noted that the association between violence and the MAOA's 2R variant appears to have an effect on violent behavior completely independent of childhood abuse. If Sam Al doesn't believe me, then he may prefer a quote from Adrian Rain's book, The Anatomy of Violence, on page 64, where he says, quote, "While many studies have shown that the low MAOA gene is especially related to antisocial behavior in those with a history of abuse, studies are beginning to show direct links between this gene and antisocial personality characteristics, irrespective of whether these subjects have been abused. Both men and women with a low MAOA gene report higher levels of lifelong aggression. Men with a rarer genetic abnormality of the MAOA gene that results in excessively low levels of MAOA have twice the level of serious delinquency and adult violence of normal controls. Furthermore, the link goes beyond self-reports or psychiatric interviews. Those with the low MAOA gene also show more aggressive behavior in a laboratory setting. There's no single gene for crime or violence, but initial research does highlight some partial role played by this gene." End quote. Lastly, Sam dismisses the association between gang membership and having the 2R or 3R variant of the MAOA gene. His argument is that if blacks are more likely to have the 2R or 3R variant of the MAOA gene, and if blacks are more likely to join gangs or act violently when in gangs, then of course one would expect to find a relationship between MAOA and gang membership or violence, because the inclusion of blacks would create such a spurious relationship. To understand the problem with Sam's argument, we can look at a study cited in my last video, exploring the association between the 2 repeat allele of the MAOA gene, promoter polymorphism, and psychopathic personality traits, incarceration, and lifetime social behavior. Authors of this study found that when they controlled for race and only looked at African American males, that blacks with the 2R variant of the gene were much more likely to commit violent crimes than blacks with the 3R variant, and blacks with the 3R variant were much more likely to be violent criminals than blacks with the 3.5R, 4R, and 5R variants. Thus, the previous study I cited shows that the 2R and 3R variants of the MAOA gene's association to gang membership and to the likelihood of someone using a weapon when in a gang is not a spurious relationship explained by the race of the gang members. This is because the MAOA gene's association to violence is independent of race. Now, in his message to me, Sam Owl said, quote, "Some people are predetermined to commit violence, but it's not caused by racial differences." I find it interesting that Sam Owl would so easily discount the possibility of an evolutionary contribution to race and crime differences, given that his cherished author, Adrian Rain, does not appear to be convinced that this is the case. When talking about several studies on the Maori, a subracial group of Pacific Islanders, Rain says on page 64 and 65 of his book, quote, "Researchers reported that Maori had twice the level of the genotype conferring low levels of MAOA compared with Caucasians in New Zealand. Researchers argued that the low MAOA genotype, which had come to be known as the warrior gene, based on research on aggression in monkeys, was evidence of positive natural selection for the Maori. They hypothesized that the Maori have been recognized as fearless warriors and have historically embarked long, dangerous canoe voyages in the migration from Polynesia to New Zealand. They were also survivors of warfare with other tribes. Researchers consequently argued from this warrior gene hypothesis that evolutionary forces may have resulted in the doubling of the frequency of the low MAOA gene in the Maori. Put another way, this gene may have conferred upon them a survival of the fearsome, an advantage on an indigenous group that now makes up 15% of the New Zealand population." Rain then wraps up the topic by saying, quote, "There is no question that we must be extraordinarily cautious in interpreting any genetic differences between ethnic groups, especially with respect to crime and violence. At the same time, the evolutionary argument put forward is not entirely implausible." Sam then concludes his comment on MAOA by saying,
"That's all I'm going to say about testing, because I've already pretty much addressed the possibility of MAOA affecting violent behavior."
Presumably, Sam means that he refuted the existence of such a possibility. I'd like to conclude this issue with a model and a passage from Adrian Rain's book, The Anatomy of Violence, pages 275 to 276. Quote, "How exactly do these genes produce an aberrant brain condition that predisposes someone to violence? Recall the low MAOA antisocial link. Males with this genetic makeup have an 8% reduction in the volume of the amygdala, the anterior cingulate, and the orbitofrontal cortex. We know that these brain structures are involved in emotion and are compromised in criminals. From genes to brain, from brain to offending. End quote. Sam L. then moves on to the issue of race and crime. He says,
ultimately, I would have to agree with you once again that blacks commit more crime on average than whites. What the statistics actually imply? Not sure.
Recall that in his first video, Sam implied that he had refuted the race realist argument that there are average racial differences in crime rates. Thus, what Sam says here is surprising. He appears to have actually conceded the point that average racial differences in crime really do exist. However, Sam L's concessions don't last long. Sam quickly takes issue with the National Crime Victimization Survey's yearly estimate of black-on-white rapes, because it varies so much from year to year. As I pointed out to him in his last video, we can certainly be skeptical about yearly subsample estimates of infrequent crimes that are infrequently reported in crime victimization surveys and thus result in small sample sizes. However, it is still true that if we aggregate several years of NCVS data, then this would produce a sample size large enough to form a reliable and valid estimate of the population proportion of these more infrequent crimes over the longer term, even if there exists inadequate data to do this in particular years. Next, Sam criticizes the fact that in order to substantiate the claim that average race and crime differences exist, I had previously noted that blacks and Hispanics as a percentage of the population are, and have consistently been, the best predictor of an area's crime rate. Sam's retort goes as follows.
This is an argument similar to the fallacious argument that whites are becoming minorities because there's more non-whites in the country now. It's a grandiose mistake because if I were to do the same test but test for blacks and whites instead, I would get the same results. I would also get the same result if I tested for whites and Hispanics. I would get an even larger result if I tested for blacks, whites, and Hispanics together. The issue with the testing here is that you're taking two groups, adding their contributions to crime together, and seeing if there's a correlate. You could do the same thing for any two groups, and you would find the same result, unless one group were extremely underrepresented in crime like Asians.
Sam's claim here is absolutely comical. Fortunately for me, because he stated his position clearly, we can easily show that the exact opposite of what he says is true. Unlike the owl, I actually performed a significance test, which shows just how wrong Sam is. I used the 2010 census data to determine the racial percentages of blacks, whites, and Hispanics for all 50 U.S. states. I then used the 2010 violent crime rates per 100,000 for all U.S. states, as reported by the FBI's Unified Crime Report. The results are as follows. The correlation coefficient between whites as a percentage of the population and violent crime is negative 0.53. The correlation between blacks as a percentage of the population and violent crime is positive 0.46. And the correlation between Hispanics as a percentage of the population and violent crime is positive 0.32. All of these aforementioned correlations are statistically significant at a 0.05 significance level or a 95% confidence level. The overall trend here is eminently clear. The more whites there are, the less crime there tends to be. The more blacks or Hispanics there are, the more crime there tends to be. If you recall, Sam says that if we added the black and white population percentages and correlated this result with violent crime, that the resulting correlation would be the same as the correlation between blacks and Hispanics as a percentage of the population and violent crime. But he is dead wrong. Here's what the evidence shows. Blacks and Hispanics as a percentage of the population correlated positively with violent crime at 0.59, and was the strongest correlation I found by far, the result being statistically significant even at a 0.01 significance level. However, contrary to what Owl says, there is literally no statistically significant correlation between blacks, whites, and blacks as a percentage of the population and violent crime. Finally, remember how Sam said that the biggest predictor of crime rates should be whites, blacks, and Hispanics as a percentage of the population? Might Sam Owl's final assertion be correct?
Nope. 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 Plana. Nope. Nope. Nope.
No, not even remotely. The correlation coefficient is essentially 0, the lowest of any I found in the dataset. This result is a clear-cut, textbook example of there being absolutely no relationship between the black, white, and Hispanic percentages added together and violent crime. I suspect that Sam Owl doesn't actually understand what a correlation coefficient is. In simple terms, a correlation coefficient is a mathematical description of the way two sets of numbers vary together and the relative strength of that relationship. If one set of numbers tends to increase as the other set increases, then the relationship is positive. If one set of numbers tends to decrease as the other one increases, then the relationship is negative. If there is no dependent pattern to the variation, then we say the variables are uncorrelated or that there is no relationship between them. Correlation coefficients require variation to produce a significant relationship between two variables. Adding blacks, whites, and Hispanics as a percentage of the population together drastically suppresses variation in the racial composition of states. Without variation, there's no relationship. So applying a correlation coefficient to a dataset designed in its inception to suppress variation by adding up virtually all racial subgroups is completely useless and has no explanatory power. If Sam knew what a correlation was, he would have never said what he said. But as he did say such things, it seems that he must be ignorant of what a correlation really is. As Sam is clearly ignorant of the subject, he should not confidently make grand proclamations about things he does not understand, because doing so makes him look like a complete ass. After this terrible blunder, Sam takes issue with the Interpol data I mentioned in my first video, which compared per capita crime rates of homogeneous countries by race. While criticizing me, Sam completely drops the context of why I said what I said. He then irrelevantly associates what I said with segregationism, in what appears to be a fallacious and thinly veiled attempt at guilt by association. What Sam fails to mention is that the peer-reviewed crime comparison I cited was designed to support the claim that the totality of evidence suggests that there are real race and crime differences, a fact that even Sam himself has conceded. This race and crime difference holds true even when using domestic and international data. Thus, what I said in my last video was designed to counter Sam's earlier implication when he appeared to allege that there were no average differences in crime rates between the races. In any case, Sam's basic argument against the Interpol data I referenced goes as follows.
There are many issues with comparing crime rates between homogeneous countries across the world, and I question why you would include this part of the refutation at all. It's one thing to state an absolute about one country, because it's an issue that needs to be looked into, but to make racial claims about the world? It seems like a universal segregationist argument. Regardless, here's what the issue is. When you compare crime statistics between countries based on homogeneity, you're overlooking several factors. One is the economic condition of those countries. Another is how those countries define crime, since we know the definition of rape can vary from country to country. My video on Swedish rape statistics examines a sterling, also widely spread example of this, which is also used to justify racial segregationist arguments. Similarly, it overlooks how the data is reported and recorded, since some countries will either try to increase the record number in order to appear in statistics, or may try to decrease the number to give the appearance that there isn't as much crime as there actually is. Once again, my video examines this. Lastly, you have to look at how effective the policing is in the countries observed, since many countries have police forces which are not as strong or effective as in other countries.
It's worth noting that Sam also questioned how the study I cited defined homogeneous countries. Sam then redundantly listed several inconsistent ways a country could be homogeneous or diverse in an apparent attempt to suggest that this was a methodological flaw of the study. I should start out by clarifying that in the study I cited, cross-national variation in violent crime rates, this study operationally defined homogeneous countries as any country that was at least 90% one race. I stated this fact in my first video, and I'll say it again. so that Sam doesn't miss it this time. The study controlled for homogeneous countries in this way, in order to eliminate the possibility of ill-defined or poorly understood mixed-race populations from influencing the validity or reliability of the results. Now, Sam's main criticism of the data is that the crime definitions vary significantly by country. So, given that different things are illegal in different countries, we cannot meaningfully compare crime rates between countries, as such a comparison would be an apples to oranges type comparison. Unfortunately, I've already told Sam what the problem with his argument was in my message to him. However, he simply ignored it and just repeated his original bad argument displayed in his message to me yet again. As I have stated previously, the study I cited only examined the crimes of forcible rape, serious assault, and murder, a fact that Sam conveniently neglected to mention. All the other types of crime were deliberately excluded from the study. This control allowed for valid international crime comparisons, as there is very little variation in the way murder, forcible rape, and serious assault is legally defined around the world in those countries studied by Interpol. Now, if you recall, Sam's second argument was that national crime statistics are reported and recorded differently in different countries, often for corrupt purposes. He says that countries also vary significantly in their policing effectiveness. Thus, Sam concludes that because of these international differences, we cannot make meaningful apples-to-apples type comparisons of national crime statistics. The problem with Sam's argument is that Interpol conducts crime victimization surveys in many of the studies it examines, where victims of crime are asked to report the crimes committed against them. Interpol also includes crime victimization surveys estimates provided by NGOs or IGO surveys, organizations with no obvious axe to grind. Thus, if a given country chronically underreports or overreports crime statistics for any reason, that discrepancy should be accounted for by more reliable crime victimization surveys carried out by external institutions. Again, this fact is somewhat moot to the debate at hand, given that Sam has already conceded that average race and crime differences exist. The next topic Sam moves on to is race and IQ. He essentially says that he failed to understand the argument I made in my first video. Sam's retort consists of him repeating what he already said in his first video. Sam says that even though there is distinguishing genetic distance on average between different races of human beings, that this fact does not prove the possibility that genetic variance in the frequency of alleles between the races could explain some of the mean racial differences in cognitive ability. Now, since Sam didn't understand the first argument I made, I will lay out an explicit logical argument in everyday language which everyone with an intuitive sense of logic should be able to follow. Premise 1. Either average between-race genetic distance proves the logical possibility that this distance might explain some of the mean racial differences in cognitive ability, as I would claim, or this fact does not prove this possibility, as Sam L. claims. Premise 2. Now, it could be the case that between-race genetic distance would not prove the logical possibility that some race differences in cognitive ability might be explained by genetic distance, if and only if there is no genetic distance between the races. Premise 3. But, given that there is real genetic distance between the races, we can conclude that between-race genetic distance proves the logical possibility that such distance might explain some of the average racial differences in cognitive ability. Now, anyone with an intuitive sense of logic and basic knowledge of genetics should immediately realize that this argument is sound. However, if anyone is curious about the exact inference rules I used to derive this conclusion, the slide that is currently displayed on your screen contains the formalized symbolic version of the argument. Next, Sam falsely asserts that when I accurately describe Richard Lynn's cold winters theory, that my characterization didn't refute anything he had said on the matter. The problem with that assertion is that Sam had previously claimed that cold winters theory wasn't a scientific claim, but an untestable hypothesis. In my initial video, I pointed out that Lynn's theory actually made no fewer than 5 testable predictions that could be true or false. Thus, I actually did refute what he said, given that the theory in question is falsifiable.
I stated that the selective pressures which would be required to have such an effect as the theory states have not been identified in any race of humans, and in fact it was the Neanderthals who went through such pressures.
This makes no sense. Lynn's theory stipulates that a specific selection pressure, climatic temperature, that could explain some of the average group differences in cognitive ability. Lynn's theory also makes definite predictions which largely reign true. I also find it interesting that Sam, despite giving no evidence, claims that Neanderthals were the only race or subspecies of Homo sapiens ever to live in an environment that selected for greater genotypic intelligence. Perhaps then he would find it interesting to learn that all continental Eurasians, Europeans and Asians, have 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA admixture, whereas sub-Saharan Africans do not possess any Neanderthal admixture. This is because Neanderthal Asian and Neanderthal European race mixing occurred sometime during the last 30 to 100,000 years in the cold northern climates of Europe and Asia, whereas similar matings did not take place between Neanderthals and Africans in the warmer climates of sub-Saharan Africa. I wonder if this realization will cause Sam any cognitive dissonance, given that he thinks there was a genotypic basis for Neanderthal intelligence which they may have passed on to some races and not others. Then again, dogmatists rarely feel conflicted. Afterwards, Sam Owl argues that we have not observed greater intelligence occurring in colder climates within any species or subspecies of animal. While this is technically true, it is completely redundant. This is because A, aside from some preliminary work on dogs, apes, and dolphins, we have little to no way to quantify the intelligence of any non-human animal in a way that is both reliable and valid, so as to establish such a relationship. And B, different animals, humans included, often respond differently to the same selection pressure. Cold environments might select for greater intelligence in humans, for reasons described in my last video. However, cold climates might have a completely different effect on polar bears, who might be able to cope with the cold not by evolving greater intelligence, but by evolving fur coats and slower metabolisms designed to store fat.
You suggest multiple tests for Lynn's theory, for example that IQ should positively correlate with skin color. Just like your argument regarding MAOA and its positive correlate with being imprisoned or being in a gang, the test is redundant. The theory regarding an explanation for the racial hierarchy is based on the existence of the racial hierarchy, so to use that basis as evidence for the claim is incredibly circular.
This clip is rather amazing. The only test for Lynn's theory Sam Owl mentions is a correlation between IQ and skin color. Sam then implies that race is equivalent to skin color and dismisses Lynn's entire argument as circular because he alleges that the only support for Lynn's evolutionary theory of race and IQ differences is predicated on no other fact than the existence of race and IQ differences. This is a bad argument for several reasons. First off, while skin color is certainly related to race, describing one's skin color is not the same thing as describing one's race, although skin color is often a biological reflection of the environment one's ancestors lived in for thousands of years. A common sense test to show why race is not the same thing as skin color can be done by comparing albino Africans to white Europeans. Both of these populations essentially have the same skin color. However, in terms of nothing more than their physical features, the shape of the face, the flatness of the nose, the form of the eyes, the cheekbones, etc., we see clear and distinguishable population differences. Secondly, races can be identified with an accuracy approaching 100% by using non-physical features unrelated to skin color, such as skeletal features or genetic markers. For instance, Neil Reich analyzed genetic data on 326 microsatellite markers for 3,636 subjects from the US and Taiwan. Subjects self-identified as belonging to one of the four major racial groups: white, black, East Asian, and Hispanic. Genetic cluster analysis of the data produced four major clusters, whose correspondence with the four self-reported races was near perfect. Genetic cluster membership and self-identified race coincided in 99.9% of the cases. In this sample, only 5 individuals, 0.14%, showed genetic cluster membership that was different from their self-reported race/ethnicity. In all of these 5 cases, all of these individuals were found to possess ancestors who differed from their self-reported race whom they did not know about. In addition, while Samuel admits that I actually suggested multiple tests for Lynn's theory, he acts as if the only prediction of Lynn's theory is a correlation between IQ and skin color. Sam then uses this as a blatant straw man to dismiss the entire theory. Sam completely fails to mention the other testable predictions of the theory I described, as well as the evidence I gave for those predictions being true. In my last video, I listed 5 testable predictions of Cold Winter's theory. I also noted additional pieces of supporting evidence which were largely consistent with the theory. The predictions I mentioned were negative correlations between national IQ and average national temperature, and between national IQ and low winter temperature. I also cited empirical evidence that national IQ correlated with average temperature at negative 0.63 to negative 0.66, and with low winter temperature at negative 0.61. I also said in my last video that Lynn's theory predicted positive correlations between national IQ and latitude, skin color, and time preference. Once again, I shall point out that the empirical evidence confirms these predictions. An IQ positively correlates with latitude at 0.68 to 0.72, with skin color at 0.84 to 0.92, and with time preference at 0.7. Lastly, I cited anthropological evidence on the relative ease of gathering food possessed by populations in warm climates, converse being true in cold climates, as well as the fact that average brain size measurements, which modestly correlates with IQ for all races, largely conformed with the theory and its predictions about large populations. East Asians in the coldest climates were noted as having the largest brains and the highest IQs, followed by Europeans with slightly smaller brains and lower IQs, living in slightly warmer climates, and Sub-Saharan Africans having the smallest brains and the lowest IQs, residing in the warmest climates by far. What Sam said in his video appears to be little more than a dishonest attempt to strawman what I said, by omitting the scope of Cold Winter's theory, the evidence for the theory, and the argument for the theory. This thereby resulted in Sam's fallacious and offhand dismissal of the theory. While talking to me personally, Sam attempts to put the final nail in Cold Winter's theory by saying,
You then go on to say that you don't agree with Lynn's theory. That being the case, let's move on.
At best, this is a quote out of context. What I actually said was that I wasn't convinced that Lynn's theory was true with a capital T. This statement is not equivalent to saying that the theory is false. My statement reflects a more generalized understanding about science. Mainly, that even if a theory consistently makes true predictions, and even if it can be used to practically invent new things or to inform us of novel and useful information, it does not follow that such a scientific theory is literally a perfect description of reality, i.e. true with a capital T. Scientific models are simplifications of the world around us. They inevitably leave things out that are true of the world. Now, I would concede in a heartbeat that scientific models are useful and necessary tools needed to gain empirical knowledge of the world. However, scientific models are always contingencies, subject to revision or rejection upon the discovery of new evidence. One should never mistake a model as a perfect reflection of reality, any more than one should mistake a map of an area for the territory itself. Thus, when I said, I don't think Lynn's theory is true with a capital T, I'm not saying that the model isn't a good representation of the territory. I'm saying I realize it's an imperfect simplification, such that I don't mistake the map for real territory. Next, Sam Al puts up a clip where I mentioned that there was evidence of a causal relationship between IQ and income, and where I also said that much of the supporting research on the subject comes from Charles Murray. It is also worth noting that while I did not explore this point in my original video, I did explore it in my PM to Sam Al. Sam then claimed that Murray's evidence of a causal relationship between IQ and income was based on A, a correlation between IQ and income, B, a correlation between IQ and educational attainment, and C, a correlation between educational attainment and income. He then said that Murray's findings do not support a causal relationship between IQ and income, but instead support a relationship between educational attainment and income. Sam acts as though Murray's research on IQ and income is merely based on three simple correlations. Nothing could be farther from the truth. This is an utter caricature of Murray's research. Murray used large amounts of data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. He divided his sample into cognitive classes by IQ score. Very bright individuals with IQs over 120 had median earned incomes of $36,000. Brights with IQs between 110 and 120 had a median of $27,000, with normals ranging in IQ from 90 to 109 at $21,000, dulls ranging between 80 and 90 at $13,000, and very dulls with IQs under 80 having a earned median income of only $7,500. Notice, during 1978, the following graph shows that median earned incomes relatively equal for all cognitive classes. This is because subjects at the time ranged in age from 13 to 21, and most were too young to even have an income. By 1993, however, the sample ages range from 28 to 36, and the income differences were very pronounced. Murray then constructed an index often used in social science research to describe parental socioeconomic status based on parents' income, education, and occupations. Using regression analysis, Murray found that one IQ point was associated with an extra $750 2013 of annual earned income. He found that this marginal increase in income was completely dependent of socioeconomic status, the magnitude of the standardized beta for IQ being over 3 times higher than for parental SES. However, this part of Murray's data does not rule out the possibility that the results used to represent socioeconomic status may be confounded and may have actually controlled for other variables that overestimated or underestimated the independent effects of IQ. To remedy this problem, Murray made an apples-to-apples comparison using a special experimental design crafted to eliminate the effects of these confounders. Murray used data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health on pairs of biological siblings who grew up together in the same household with the same parents, but who had different IQs. Specifically, Moore looked at sibling pairs in which one sibling fell into the normal range of IQ scores, from 90 to 109, and in which the other sibling fell into a different cognitive class. This resulted in a sample of 2,859 sibling pairs, who had their incomes tracked from 1978, when the subjects ranged in age from 13 to 21, until 1993, when they ranged in age from 28 to 36. This analytical structure controls for socioeconomic background of the siblings, their family structure, and their upbringing. The results show the exact same pattern as before. Those siblings with higher IQs have incomes higher than their counterpart with lower IQs, even though both siblings are raised in the same household and the same family environment. Murray also constructed a utopian sample of 3,908 highly privileged siblings from the same dataset. The sample consisted of full biological siblings who grew up in the same household. Murray excluded from example children born to single mothers, a factor known to affect IQ and income. He excluded children with divorced parents, children born out of wedlock, and children whose parents were in the bottom of 25% of the income distribution. Murray then performed the same test. Once again, the same basic association between IQ and income was found, and the basic pattern of averages was largely unchanged. Sam then adds that he would agree that there is a causal relationship between IQ and occupational prestige for, quote, obvious reasons, which he never stated. Now, if you recall, Sam said, quote, Murray's findings do not uphold the result that IQ results in income. In fact, they more strongly support the relationship between educational attainment and high income, end quote. Sam Owl gives zero evidence or argument designed to explain how Murray's findings don't uphold a causal relationship between IQ and income. He also gives no evidence or argument to show that Murray's results better support a relationship between educational attainment and high income. In both cases, he fails to meet the burden of proof. However, in general, it only makes sense for an egalitarian to discount IQ having a causal effect on income only if family upbringing, family structure, poverty, and parental socioeconomic status are causally responsible for the relationship between educational attainment and income. Put simply, egalitarians should hold that children who grow up in poor households, in bad families, that attend bad schools, in an unnurturing environment, should be caused by their environment to have lower educational attainment. And lower educational attainment should cause a lowering of income on average, and vice versa. Thus, egalitarians must claim that IQ's association to income is a spurious relationship affected by the confounding variable of socioeconomic status and upbringing. However, we know this is not the case. Murray's data and other data shows that IQ correlates with educational attainment independent of family background, upbringing, or parental socioeconomic status. We also know from the American Psychological Association that educational attainment and IQ are independently correlated with income. So it does not appear to be the case that Murray's evidence supports Sam's assertion, and Sam Owl offers zero evidence to the contrary beyond his unsupported assertions, which we are apparently just supposed to accept on faith. Sam then criticizes Murray's link between job performance and IQ because he alleges with no evidence that the former can't be empirically defined. He then claims that Murray confuses occupational prestige with high income. However, while what Sam says here is highly problematic, I won't even bother with a rebuttal, since I said absolutely nothing about job performance or occupational prestige, and since Sam provided no arguments for his claims. Finally, regarding IQ and income, Sam asserted,
"You said that the longitudinal correlate between IQ and GDP are proof of causation, yet you provide no evidence that it was anything but another correlate, which could easily be claimed to be the other way around, or result in many other factors."
The problems with this are many. First, I never said that a strong, persistent longitudinal correlation between national IQ and per capita income and economic growth was proof of causation. I suggested that it was supporting evidence of a causal relationship. Evidence for X is not the same thing as proof of X. Longitudinal relationships are the second strongest type of data used to establish causation, the weakest being cross-sectional data, and the strongest being rigorous experimental data. Longitudinal correlations establish that an association is robust, that the trend persists over time in different generations and in different environments, and is thus far less likely to be the result of cultural differences or ephemeral environmental factors. Longitudinal data can also be used to make the inference about the direction of causality, given that alternative hypotheses can be ruled out on grounds that the proposed antecedent does not precede the proposed consequent. Secondly, the claim Sam made in his last video was that even if race and IQ differences were caused by genetic differences, that it wouldn't matter anyway. I argued because there is reason to think that IQ differences may affect differences in income, that to care about IQ, that one only needs to care about poverty, the implications of this being that since probably does care about income inequality, that this is one reason that he might care about IQ and the genetic race and IQ difference. Finally, of course I didn't offer lots of evidence and argument that national IQ's relationship to economic performance was causal. That would require ruling out alternative hypotheses, establishing the direction of causality, and it would probably take an entire separate video to do such a thing. The point I made was relatively minor and was not even really directly related to IQ's relationship to income, but was related to reasons for caring about IQ. Now, before I go on to what Sam Owl says next, recall the claims Sam made in his last video. In that video he said,
"If genetics were responsible for IQ, and assuming the classification that race realists use is accurate although it's self-serving at best, then why do we not see an increased IQ on average among people of African descent mixed with people of European descent? The only conclusion I can make regarding that is that it doesn't matter if somebody actually is black, rather it's dependent on whether or not they're perceived as black."
If you look at Sam's first video, He provides absolutely no evidence for this assertion whatsoever. To counter his unsupported assertion, I cited 3 different studies, which found that mulattoes had IQ scores mid-range between blacks and whites. Now, how did Sam respond to this evidence? He started off by saying,
"The fact of the matter is that having one white parent and one black parent doesn't determine how much of either parent's genes you're going to receive."
Apparently, Sam doesn't understand how the basics of inheritance work. Let's watch a grade school video on genetics explaining the basics of inheritance to see why Sam is wrong.
Your genes come from your parents, of course, and from their parents, and from their parents' parents, and, well, you get the idea. You have 2 sets of 23 chromosomes, 1 set from each parent. For almost every chromosome you inherit from your mother, you also inherit one from your father that has his versions of the same genes. Together, they form a pair of homologous chromosomes. The X and Y chromosomes, however, are special. Usually, females have 2 X chromosomes, while males have an X and a Y. You get one of your X chromosomes from your mother. Whether you get your father's X chromosome or his Y chromosome determines your sex. Most adult cells contain 2 sets of chromosomes, but sperm and egg cells have only 1 set of 23 chromosomes each. When the body forms sperm or egg cells, a cell divides and pairs of chromosomes separate. A random member of each pair moves into each new cell. This is why, when you were conceived, you obtained half of your mother's genes and half of your father's genes. But your siblings didn't necessarily get the same versions of your parents' genes that you did. Unless you happen to be an identical twin.
So, if you have 2 parents, one of whom is an unmixed white European, and the other of whom is an unmixed black African, and if these parents procreate to produce offspring, their child would inherit a random half of black genes from his or her black parent, and another random half of white genes from his or her white parent. Now, while it is true that not all mulattoes are the product of pure black-white couplings, and may have varied admixture percentages, they are still distinguishable from blacks and whites as a group on average, and their admixture percentage should fall on average somewhere between 100% black and 100% white. Sam then says,
"If the study had tested DNA-based ancestry, then it would have been a more compelling argument."
Sam's statement here is absolutely correct. It is true that a study using modern, multi-locus genetic testing to infer black-white racial admixture percentages, and to correlate this with IQ, would be a far more compelling study. A study like this would be a direct test of the hereditarian hypothesis. Such tests have been repeatedly proposed by hereditarians such as Arthur Jensen, Philip Rushton, Richard Lynn, Linda Gottfredson, and others. Hereditarian theory predicts a positive correlation between white admixture percentages in blacks and IQ, whereas egalitarianism predicts that there should be no such correlation whatsoever. Believe it or not, many egalitarians have actually openly refused to study the issue. One may also be surprised to learn that there has never been a single study that tries to establish a correlation between IQ and racial admixture using the methods of modern genetics. What's amazing is, even if such a correlation were found, and even if it were significant, this would not prove the hereditarian hypothesis, because there could still be many other confounding variables. On the other hand, if cogent and robust multi-locus genetic measures were used to measure racial ancestry, if the population studied were large and randomly sampled, ranging from 100% black to 100% white, if no correlation were found, and if this result were replicated, then this would be a straightforward way for egalitarians to falsify their hereditarian hypothesis on race differences in intelligence. Thus, while it would be very easy to do such a study, it presumably has never been tried because of the sheer cowardice of many egalitarians. Many egalitarians must fear that the resulting empirical evidence from such a study would support a genetic basis for race differences in intelligence, which is probably the reason why no study like this has ever been undertaken. In any case, Sam proceeds to claim,
accounting only for skin color or for a white and black parent still does not control for overall perception of racial appearance, even if some of the parents were told their adoptive child had 2 black parents instead of 1 white and 1 black parent. The child still looks the same, and this measurement of European ancestry is unreliable.
What Sam is talking about here is the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. In this study, white, black, and mulatto children, as well as children of other races, were all adopted as young children into upper-middle-class white families, and were raised to adulthood by those families. In this study, 12 of the parents were mistakenly told by the adoption agency that their adopted black child was black, when in actuality the child was mulatto, possessing 1 black and 1 white parent. Thus, both the adopted parents and the adopted children themselves believed that the children were completely black when they were actually mulattoes. At the end of the study, significance testing revealed that there was no statistically significant difference between the average IQ scores of the misidentified mulattoes who thought they were black and the other mulattoes in the sample who believed that they were mulattoes, and whose adopted parents did also. Now, Sam Owl claims that the Minnesota study merely accounted for skin color and didn't control for racial appearance. Presumably he means that aside from the parents, that people who interacted with the misidentified children may have believed that some of the children were black, some of the children were mulattoes, all of the children were black, or all of the children were mulattoes. Thus, there were inadequate controls on the social perception of race that may or may not have affected the IQ scores of the children. That is certainly true, which is also why I cited other evidence to substantiate the point, and to counter his earlier claims. However, all of the misidentified children in the Minnesota study did believe that they were black, and so did their parents. So, given that there is no statistically significant mean IQ difference between these children at age 17 and the rest of the mulattoes in the sample, this is evidence that neither self-perceptions of race nor parental perceptions or expectations about the race of their child influences the IQ or intellectual development of the children.
Now, the reason this source is so interesting is because the other findings of the study were that if you place a black or interracial child in the household of high-class whites, their IQ and school performance significantly increase, and the IQ gap closes. This is also true for adoptive white and Asian children, although, by time 2, almost everyone's performance dropped. Before the suggestion is made, differences in the decline rates between races were not found to be of any statistical significance.
It's worth noting that during the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, 2 different IQ tests were given to the children at ages 7 and 17, and both of these studies were normed and standardized differently. In order to run a significance test designed to detect a statistically significant difference between the IQ score decline of the same subjects of a single race between 2 different times, one would need to adjust the scores for the Flynn effect. Failure to do this is an apples to oranges type comparison because the norms used at the initial test dates were obsolete. This was not done for the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study until the year 2000, until John Lowland corrected the data for the Flynn effect. However, to run a significance test between 2 dependent sample means requires a specialized test. This is because 1. Within-race IQ scores obtained from the same sample but compared at 2 different time periods are dependent, not independent. And 2. The sample sizes in the Minnesota study dropped for every single race between times T1 and times T2. Some children dropped out of the study by age 17. As such, the cohorts between the 2 time periods were unequal. Thus, one could not run an ordinary student t-test for 2 independent sample means. Instead, one would have to run a hypothesis test for 2 dependent, overlapping means of unequal sample sizes to account for the missing data. To my knowledge, no one has run such a test while correcting for the Flynn effect, so nothing can be said on the matter. Sam also gives us no evidence or citation for his claim that the racial decline in IQ scores wasn't statistically significant. However, what can be compared using a significance test is the racial IQ means between the races at age 17, after the genes of the children have been expressed. Now we know that A, the Minnesota study's racial samples are independent, B, the samples come from normally distributed populations, and C, that the population standard deviation for IQ scores for all races is equal to about 15 IQ points. And if we conduct a significance test, then we see that there are statistically significant differences between the mean IQs of the different races at age 17 in the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study sample. Even though the children of all these races have the same parental socioeconomic status, the same upbringing, the same family environment found in white upper-middle-class households. Now, if you recall, Sam Owl also said that race and IQ gaps largely close during the studies when we look at the children at age 7 at time T1. The problem is, he fails to make an apples-to-apples type comparison. The black-white IQ gap is actually non-existent before age 4, and detecting a statistically significant difference at age 4 requires a very large sample with adequate statistical power, given that the group differences are very small. Now, before people start using the comparatively small mean black-white IQ difference in early childhood as evidence that the racial gaps must be environmental, I'd like the audience to first consider an analogy. If you compare the average breast sizes of young boys and girls, you'll likely find no statistically significant difference between boys and girls in terms of their breast size before the age of 7. After that period, breast size in women increases with age, and so does the breast size gap between men and women, similar to how the IQ gap increases with age between blacks and whites. However, with good reason, no one thinks that the increasing breast size difference between males and females, absent in early childhood, is the result of environmental differences. But instead, we think the gap must largely result from the male-female genetic differences. Thus, to be consistent, we must admit that there is no good reason to interpret an age-related increase in any average difference in some phenotype between 2 or more populations as a sign of environmental influence. Aside from this counterexample, the basic reason for this is the heritability of many phenotypes, such as IQ scores, actually increases drastically with age. Thus, inferring that the environment is responsible for the increasing phenotypic difference with age is unwarranted, because until genes can be ruled out, there's always the very real possibility of genetic explanation. In any case, if we compare the results of the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study's IQ sample estimates to the normal black-white IQ gap, it appears almost identical at ages 7 and age 17, as shown by the following graph. The normal black-white IQ gap estimate over time was taken from the James Flynn's book, What is Intelligence, page 123, published in 2009. Flynn is a well-respected egalitarian intelligence researcher and is also an emeritus professor of political studies. Flynn notes that from age 4, the mean black IQ scores, which are about 96, tend to drop about 0.6 point per year when adjusted for obsolete norms until blacks are about age 24. Now, if we instead examine the difference between the normal white reference and the mulatto mean from the Minnesota study, we also see that the racial gaps are increasing over time. While I suspect this is normal, I know of no developmental IQ data on the white-mulatto IQ gap over time, when matched for age between the ages of 2 to 24. If the Minnesota study had the benefit of larger sample sizes, I suspect the study's sample difference between the races would be even closer to what they normally are. Notice that curiously the Minnesota white sample from age 7 onward seems to regress toward the normal white mean by age 17. Thus, contrary to what Sam Owl says, the gap displayed at age 7 appears fairly consistent with the normal observation of IQs at age 7, at least for blacks and whites. Sam then remarks upon my reference of South African IQ data from the study The Suitability of Raven's Standard Progressive Matrices for Various Groups in South Africa, which was published in the Journal of Personality and Individual Differences in 1992. This study looked at thousands of South African whites, mulattoes, and blacks. This study found that South African whites had a mean IQ score of about 100, with mulattoes averaging about 85 and blacks about 70. Once again, this evidence is inconsistent with Sam's earlier unsupported claim that mulattoes don't score higher than blacks do on IQ tests, as this clearly shows that they do. Sam responded to this evidence with the following smug response.
The greatest part about a test of racial IQs in South Africa between blacks and whites? You can all figure that one out.
What's amazing is Sam offers no argument as to why this study is wrong. He simply gives an implicit and fallacious appeal to ridicule, and then dismisses the entire dataset offhand, apparently because Sam mistakenly thinks that he's actually proved something. This particular study is interesting because during South African apartheid, while blacks living in the white portions of South Africa were segregated and did not possess certain rights, mulattoes were essentially in the same boat as blacks and were similarly segregated and restricted in their behavior. However, mulattoes still scored one standard deviation higher on IQ tests than African blacks did during the last days of apartheid, despite having the same general lack of political rights as blacks. Thus, while apartheid conditions might have explained some of the black-white IQ gap in South Africa, they cannot explain the black-mulatto IQ gap. Sam also touches on Rowe's examination of the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. Rowe's study found, despite his deliberate oversampling of blacks with educated parents, that adult verbal IQ of mulattoes fell mid-range between those of blacks and whites, contrary to what Sam claims. Rowe found that when groups of independent interviewers erroneously judged a mulatto respondent in the sample to be completely black, that the mean IQ score of these respondents still fell mid-range in IQ between blacks and whites. Thus, social perceptions of race appear to make no difference to the IQ scores of the subject. However, Sam's argument against this study went as follows.
I would still argue that perception of the interviewer concerning whether the child was black or mixed does not reflect how they had generally been perceived by society, but since I'm getting bored, let's move to my own references.
Yet again, Sam gives no reasoning, no evidence, and no argument to support his claims. He just blindly asserts the opposite of the study's conclusion. Thus, again, we can dismiss him for failing to meet the burden of proof, given that he made no attempt to do so.
Start with a study conducted by Tizard and Cooperman, which is given in the book The Black-White Test Score Gap. The study, which was conducted in accordance with international adoption standards, found that when white children, mixed children, and black children were reared in, quote, highly enriched institutional environments, the average IQ scores were 103, 106, and 108 respectively at the ages of 4 and 5.
Sam L. conveniently admits the rest of the paragraph of the text he's reading, which implies that there were no black Africans in the study cited, but West Indians. West Indians have African, Indian, Chinese, Middle Eastern, Amerindian, and European admixtures, and most of these populations have IQ means far higher than pure Africans. Fortunately, I was able to track down the original 1972 study Sam is referencing. It is titled The Environmental Effects of Language Development, a study of young children in long-stay residential nurseries. It turns out that all of the mixed-race children in this study were West Indian children who had white mothers. In actuality, none of the children in the study appear to be predominantly of sub-Saharan African ancestry. Now, since the race of the mother is the biggest predictor of an individual's IQ, we would expect this development to clearly boost the mean IQ of the mixed children and to skew the distribution in an unrepresentative way. Sam also neglected to mention that the study he's citing lumped in half Indian and half white children together with full West Indian children into one single group. Researchers can then compare this lumped group's IQ mean to the IQ mean of white children. However, the issues don't stop there. If we look at Table 5 of the study in question, we see that the IQ tests given to the children were composed of 3 subtest batteries displayed on your screen: the Rennell Comprehension Battery, the Rennell Expression Battery, and the Minnesota Nonverbal Battery. On these first 2 batteries, there was no statistically significant difference whatsoever between the IQ scores of white children and the lumped group of pure mixed Indians. On the third test, however, there was a slight statistically significant difference between the lumped group and whites concerning their nonverbal IQ, the lumped group having slightly higher average scores than whites. However, this result and the study's methodology are extremely problematic, such that the external validity of the study is totally compromised for a whole host of reasons. A. None of the samples in the study were random, and they were all select samples of very young children whose genes had yet to be expressed. B. The 2 non-white groups were lumped together, which tells us absolutely nothing about the mean IQs of either group in isolation. C. The study sample sizes were very small. The total number of children measured by the third battery dropped from the 85 children measured by the first 2 batteries, which found no group differences, to only 54 children tested using the third battery, which was the only battery to find a statistically significant IQ difference. D. Unlike the Minnesota study, the study's authors did not control for parental IQ. E. Since the research was done entirely in British orphanages in the 1970s, it is very likely that the West Indian children were from an unrepresentative, elite sample of privileged Indian parents who could afford to go to Britain. On the other hand, the unusual British orphans likely came from underprivileged backgrounds, making this a faulty apples to oranges type comparison, a possibility that even James Flynn concedes. F. We have no idea what the white West Indian IQ gaps in Britain normally are at age 4, so as to allow for valid age-based racial comparisons. G. Mentally retarded children living in the orphanages of all races were intentionally excluded from the results, making the sample even more unrepresentative. H. Researchers in this study failed to retest the children's IQ past adolescence, unlike the Minnesota study. Thus, it's entirely possible that the race and IQ gaps were obliterated at adulthood when the genes of the children were expressed, although we have no way of verifying this one way or the other given the flawed scope of the study. I. West Indian immigrants to the United States are already known to be a unrepresentative high IQ subsample of mixed race descent, so it is very likely that the same thing was true for the West Indians in Britain. Thus, the Tizard and Cooperman study on West Indians, mixed Indians, and whites does absolutely nothing to prove the black-white IQ gap is either the result of environmental factors or that there is no significant difference between mulattoes and blacks when raised in the same environments. Never missing a beat to make a misleading claim, however, Sam moves on to say that a study of monozygotic twins raised apart found that the heritability of IQ was less than 20%. Now, I can find no reference for Sam's claim. However, given that large meta-analysis performed on the heritability of IQ from the American Psychological Association and from other researchers put IQ's heritability between 0.6 to 0.9 for adults, the only possible explanation is that Sam must be referencing a twin study done on very young children whose genes have not yet been expressed, but which will be expressed as they age. Only twin studies on very young children show such low IQ heritabilities. However, such studies are essentially worthless to discussing race and IQ, because A, the heritability of IQ increases with age, B, the race and IQ gap concerns the population as a whole and not children in particular, and C, without good reason to suppose otherwise, within race heritability estimates don't imply that genes or environmental factors explain any particular proportion of phenotypic variance between the races, thus making such twin studies spectacularly unhelpful.
The book also examined your reference of the study conducted by Scar and Weinberg, concluding multiple testing issues with their study. For example, the black children in the study were adopted at a much later point in time than the white children, which is, as Scar and Weinberg even conceded, a factor in scoring lower IQs.
In his book, The G Factor, Arthur Jensen reviewed the Minnesota study and other similar adoption studies involving East Asians. Jensen found that the age at which the children were first adopted in these studies appeared to have no effect on the IQ scores of adopted children beyond age 7.
Also, the biological mothers of the black children had considerably lower education than the standard of black women in the region they took the sample from.
That is true. However, A, the biological mothers of the black children did not raise their children. B, unless Sam is claiming that selecting for women with low educational standing controls for genetic disadvantage, expressed as low intelligence, a fact seemingly inconsistent with an egalitarian hypothesis, I fail to see how this fact helps Sam's argument. And C, the average IQ of the biological parents in the Minnesota study, most of whom were non-white, had IQ scores above 120. Over 1.3 standard deviations above the white mean of 100.
Finally, the white children, in terms of quality placement, were placed in higher quality environments than that of the black children.
While there was a slight difference in the social class of adoptive parents, whites tending to be adopted by parents of slightly higher social class, and black adoptees tending slightly to the converse, parental SES has been shown repeatedly to have little or no effect on IQ. Arthur Jensen and the American Psychological Association have both concluded that parental SES cannot explain the race and IQ gaps.
One more study to look at is conducted by Elsie Moore in 1986. Moore conducted a study of a group of black and mixed-race children who were raised in black or white middle-class adoptive families. The study found that the children raised in white middle-class families scored a higher average IQ than those raised in black families, and there was found to be little difference between the average IQs of the two groups, whether raised by adopted blacks or whites, thus refuting the claim that mixed-race children supposedly have higher IQs because of their white admixture.
This is an incredibly bold pronouncement considering the sample sizes being compared. Moore divided his sample of 46 blacks and mixed children in half. In the first group, 17 blacks and 6 mulattoes were adopted by traditional black families. In the second group, 9 blacks and 14 mulattoes were adopted by white families. While it is true that there were no statistically significant differences between the samples being compared, we're talking about incredibly small sample sizes. 6 mulattoes being compared to 17 blacks in one sample, and 14 mulattoes being compared to only 9 blacks in another. These sample sizes are far too small to generalize from. The Minnesota study, for instance, had more blacks and about 3 times more mulattoes in its samples. Furthermore, this sample is a convenient sample. It is not remotely random. Rowe's examination of the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health used a nationally representative sample that involved over 10,000 whites, thousands of blacks, and hundreds of mulattoes. Rowe found that there were statistically significant differences in mean verbal IQ score between the races, whites scoring the highest, followed by mulattoes in the middle, with blacks scoring below mulattoes. Given that larger and more representative studies found a 3-place racial relation, one which has also been replicated in other studies, the most likely explanation of why Moore's sample showed no statistically significant difference in IQ but in the IQs of blacks and mulattoes was because his sample comprised a very tiny sample that was non-random and was a convenient sample. This sample had a built-in selection bias, which selected for high IQ blacks low IQ mulattoes, or some mix of both. Furthermore, the average age of the children in Moore's sample was 8 years old. Moore failed, as did Cooperman and Tizard, to retest their samples past adolescence to verify if the IQ gains or the lack of a mulatto-black IQ difference persisted over time. It's completely possible that both the IQ difference and the IQ gains returned to normal in this sample by adulthood. We literally have no way of knowing given the severe limitations of Moore's study. From here, Sam moves on to attacking the validity of IQ research. Sam begins by name-dropping an academic paper published in 2009 in which he claims to demonstrate cultural bias in IQ testing. However, he never mentions what the paper says or how it supports his argument. Thus, yet again, he has failed to meet the burden of proof, as name-dropping a paper and claiming it supports your claims is not evidence or argument sufficient to meet the burden of proof or sufficient to convince any rational person of anything. Now here's where things get interesting. In his first video, the Dishonest Owl says,
"We're not the only ones who see the same kind of differences in IQ. In Japan, the historically oppressed Buraku people have, on average, lower IQs than the more populous Japanese people. When the Buraku leave Japan, however, the IQ gap closes. Oppression leads to lesser conditions, which leads to lesser opportunity, which leads to lesser IQ."
Sam also claimed that the same thing happened with Koreans in Japan. In his first video, Sam provided no evidence for this claim. However, in his second video, Sam alleges that he provided showed the Barakuman Japanese IQ gap, the Korean Japanese IQ gap, the foundation of these gaps on oppression, and the removal of the Korean/Barakuman Japanese IQ gap when such populations left Japan. Now, unfortunately for Sam Owl, I have access to almost every academic article in existence through my university. The article Sam cites is titled "Japan's Invisible Race, Caste and Culture and Personality," published in 1968 in the Journal of Modern Asian Studies. This article is extremely obscure and very few people have access to it. However, I can access it. The paper Sam linked is a 4-page article that consists of another researcher's review of a Japanese book on the Barakuman people of Japan. The article Sam cites says absolutely nothing about IQ, the Barakuman Japanese IQ difference, or the Korean Japanese IQ difference. It only delves briefly into the history of Japanese oppression of the Barakuman. Thus, the fact that Sam Owl is a lying asshole has become all but too apparent. Either he didn't read the article and then claimed it supported his argument, which would make him dishonest, or he read the article and then blatantly lied about its contents, which would also make him dishonest. So, no matter what way the cookie crumbles, the fact of the matter is, Sam is a charlatan, and that is undeniable.
You pompous, stuck-up, snot-nosed, English, giant, twerp, scumbag, fuckface, dickhead, asshole!
Oh, and the last bit of Sam's video is my favorite part. During this portion, Sam attempts to refute one of my citations. In particular, he targets the peer-reviewed article 30 Years of Research on Race Differences in Cognitive Ability. This article was authored by Arthur Jensen and Philip Rushton. Both of these individuals are deceased professors of psychology emeritus. Both taught at reputable universities. Both have published hundreds of peer-reviewed articles. Both have written psychology textbooks, and both have earned academic awards and academic distinctions in their respective fields. Sam's so-called argument consists of nothing more than the attempted discreditation of one of the article's authors, Philip Rushton. The gist of Sam's argument involves mindlessly regurgitating one wholly unoriginal and fallacious argument. Sam argues that because Philip Rushton's research has sometimes been funded by the Pioneer Fund, that his research shouldn't even be addressed, and should instead be discarded and forgotten. Sam's reason for this is that the Pioneer Fund was originally founded by a racist who had eugenicist aspirations for the fund. Sam also notes that in the early 1940s, the Pioneer Fund helped publish the autobiography of a novelist associated with the Ku Klux Klan. The fallacy of Sam's argument stems from two corrupt branches. First, he falsely infers that the historical aims of an organization in the distant past reflect the present realities true of the same organization today. The problem is, it does not follow that because organization Y had specific aim X in the past, that Y's aim in the present is also X. To see why, we can look at Henry Ford. Anyone with a sense of history knows that Henry Ford was an unrepentant anti-Semite who was openly praised by Adolf Hitler. Ford also published many anti-Semitic pamphlets, such as the International Jew, and also devoted significant amounts of time and his personal fortune to fighting Jewry and Jewish interests. Perhaps then we would be shocked to learn that Henry Ford started the Ford Foundation. Now, by Sam Al's logic, we should believe that the Ford Foundation today is a hotbed of anti-Semitism, and that anyone who receives money from the foundation should be discredited and or labeled as a Nazi or some sort of fascist. But anyone who knows anything about the Ford Foundation today knows that it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or fascism whatsoever. Currently, the Ford Foundation is just an ordinary private foundation that gives out money to fund education, the creative arts, and to reduce poverty. Thus, we see that Sam Al's inference that the pioneer's organizational past must be comparable to its organizational present is blatantly fallacious, as such conclusion simply does not follow from the premises, given that there are clear-cut counterexamples. Secondly, Sam Al is guilty of the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is any argument purporting that the truth or falsity of a claim depends solely on its origins, which are actually irrelevant, and not because of any external reason or fact of the matter. The genetic fallacy has the form, because the origins of claim X are Y, it follows that X must be true, or conversely, because the origins of claim X are Y, it follows that X must be false and dismissed. Sam asserts that we are justified in dismissing Rushton's claims as false or untrustworthy, simply because of Rushton's origins and associations, and not because of any external fact of the matter, or for any other reason. The problem with Sam's argument is, the origins or associations of claims have absolutely nothing to do with their truth values. The truth value of a claim is always independent of a claim's origins. If a crazy person says, "the sky is blue," his statement does not become any truer or falser because of his insanity. If a Nazi tells you that all objects with mass attract, his distasteful political views aren't an argument against the truth of his claim or the physical laws it's based on. And if a very respectable astrophysicist in a lab coat tells you that the moon is made of cheese, his claim is still false, and the truth of this scientist's claim is wholly unaffected by his academic credentials. Sam Al argued for dismissing Rushton's claims as false or untrustworthy, not by arguing against them with induction, evidence, or rational argument, but by attacking Rushton's credibility via trying to associate Rushton with nefarious things. Sam's argument is the very essence of the genetic fallacy, and thus we have no reason to believe anything he says on the matter. In addition, Sam doesn't even address the fact that the very article he's attacking was co-authored by one of the most eminent and frequently cited psychometricians of the 20th century, Arthur Jensen. Should all of Jensen's valuable research, most of which has nothing to do with race whatsoever, also be discarded and forgotten, simply because Jensen is associated with Rushton? In any case, Sam Al then continues to drop the names of various authors and articles which he claims criticize Rushton's theories. Sam then drops the name of another researcher who he alleges has, quote, discredited Rushton, and who has also, quote, proved that Rushton was biased against blacks. However, Sam provides zero evidence and no argument explaining how these authors allegedly came to some conclusions, or even if they came to such conclusions at all. Since Sam never explains how what he alleges Rushton's critics say supports his argument, it pains me to say that yet again Sam has failed to meet the burden of proof for his claims, and we can dismiss what he says purely on that basis alone. Near the end of his video, Sam mentions what he calls an interesting article on Rushton's quantitative research on penis size and male sex organs. This appears to be a rather transparent and juvenile attempt to discredit the entirety of Rushton's work by appealing to ridicule. This interpretation is an inference to the best explanation for Sam's behavior, given that he brings it up while criticizing Rushton, just before claiming that all of his work should be discarded and forgotten. This is also likely given that there was no mention of penis size in the debate he and I were having, and given that Sam offered no argument explaining how Rushton's sex research falsified any of his work. Now you might be wondering, why does Sam do this? There are some persuasive arguments for racial egalitarianism, so why not review such evidence to rebut Rushton's work? It's because Sam apparently lacks the intellectual ability and the integrity to form good arguments. This lying owl has abandoned rational argument and slings mud at the reputations of those he disagrees with in order to avoid the much harder task of forming rational arguments in support of his beliefs and claims. Anytime you see someone abandon an argument for mudslinging or name-calling, don't take offense. Just remember, this is a childish admission from the person in question that he or she has just lost the argument.
One final closing statement though, in regards to Laughing Man's video as a whole, to take the wise words of somebody who commented on my original video, the best way to interpret Laughing Man's is by way of Hanlon's razor. Hopefully that wasn't too sarcastic for my viewers' taste, but if so, I can bear it.
From here on out, I am done with Sam Owl. He is not worth one more minute of my time. However, I have a final closing statement in regard to Sam Owl's video as a whole. The statement can be summed up in 2 words: game over.
Kano wins. Flawless victor fatality.